You're not my husband anymore. You're just a bank account.
7 years, Chloe. And that's genuinely how you see me?
Don't act surprised. You were never home. You were never really here, even when you were.
Get out!
You can't just throw me out.
I already did.
The private jet landed 4 days earlier than planned, and that single change in schedule was about to blow my entire life apart. I wasn't supposed to be home. I was supposed to be in Singapore, closing a deal that would push Apex Tech's valuation past $2 billion. But my head of security, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Frank Ross, called me at 2 a.m. local time with a voice I had never heard him use before. Tense, careful, like a man walking on ice. "Sir," he said, "there's something you need to see. It's about your accounts, and it's about Chloe." I remember sitting up in that hotel bed, my heart already pounding before he explained anything. When you build a fortune from nothing, when you claw your way up from a 2-bedroom apartment to owning a tech company that employs 6,000 people, you develop an instinct, a radar for when something is wrong. And that night, every alarm in my body was screaming. I cancelled the Singapore meeting. I didn't sleep on the flight home. I just stared at the printouts Ross had emailed me. Records of late-night transfers moving out of my personal trust account, routed through channels I didn't recognize, in amounts too structured to be a coincidence. Someone had been bleeding me slowly, carefully, for months, and whoever it was had access most people simply don't have. By the time I landed, the sun hadn't even risen yet. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want her to have even 1 hour of warning. The villa was silent when I walked in, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like a held breath. I found Chloe in the living room, curled up on the couch in her silk robe, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine beside her, like she didn't have a single thing to worry about. She looked up at me, startled for half a second, then recovered so fast it almost impressed me. "You're early," she said. I didn't answer. I placed the manila folder Ross had prepared for me on the coffee table and let it fall open. Surveillance stills spilled out, grainy but unmistakable. A luxury resort in the mountains, a private terrace, Chloe wrapped in the arms of a man I trusted with my entire financial future. Marcus Sterling, my wealth manager, the man who had handled my investments for nearly a decade, the man I'd hired straight out of business school because I believed in loyalty built over time. I watched her face as she looked down at the photos. I expected tears. I expected panic, some scramble to explain it away, to call it a mistake, a moment of weakness. That's what people do when they're caught. They cry, they beg. Chloe didn't do any of that. Her expression went cold instead, flat, unreadable, almost bored. She set her wine glass down slowly, like she was giving herself time to choose her words. And then she looked at me with an expression I will never forget for the rest of my life. Not guilt, not fear. Disdain. "You're not my husband anymore," she said, her voice steady, almost clinical. "You're just a bank account." The words hit harder than the photographs had. 7 years of marriage, and that's how she saw me. Not a partner, not someone she'd built a life with, a resource. A number in an account she thought she was entitled to drain. Something in me went very still and very quiet. I've negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without blinking. I've sat across from men trying to destroy my company and kept my composure. But nothing prepares you for hearing the person who shares your bed reduce 7 years of your life to a transaction. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I simply took out my phone. 3 taps. That's all it took to revoke her biometric access to the smart house system. The fingerprint scanners, the retina locks, the voice command overrides I had installed for our security, back when I still believed we needed protecting from the outside world instead of from each other. Another few taps froze the joint credit lines linked to my accounts, the ones she'd been using freely for years without ever once asking where the money actually came from. Chloe's face changed then, the mask cracking for just a moment, real alarm flashing through her eyes as she realized what I was doing. "You can't just—" "I can," I said. It was the first thing I'd said to her since walking in, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Get out." She tried to argue, tried to grab my arm as I called for the 2 security guards stationed at the gate. Outside, the storm that had been building all evening finally broke, thunder rolling over the cliffs as rain began hammering the villa's windows. I stood in the doorway and watched as my guards escorted her out into it. No umbrella, no warning, just the downpour and the dark. She turned back once, soaked through, her mascara running in black rivers down her face, and shouted something I couldn't hear over the storm. I didn't open the door again. I told myself, standing there in the empty living room with rain hammering the glass, that this was the worst night of my life. The betrayal, the affair, the humiliation of being called nothing but a bank account by the woman I'd trusted with everything. I had no idea. Not yet. Because the affair wasn't even the real story. It was only the beginning. I hadn't slept in almost 30 hours, but sleep wasn't what my body needed. It was answers. For the past few months, something had been wrong with me. Small things at first. My hand trembling slightly when I held my morning coffee, a strange heaviness behind my eyes by mid-afternoon, dizzy spells that hit me out of nowhere in the middle of board meetings. I'd mentioned it to Chloe more than once, expecting concern. Instead, she always waved it off with the same tired explanation. "You're just exhausted, babe. You work too hard. You need rest, not doctors." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife. She was supposed to be the one person looking out for me when I was too buried in spreadsheets and shareholder calls to look out for myself. So the morning after I threw her out, still running on adrenaline and 3 hours of broken sleep, I drove myself to St. Jude Medical Laboratory downtown. I hadn't planned it as some big investigation. I just wanted to rule things out. Stress, blood pressure, maybe early signs of something manageable. I told myself I'd get a clean bill of health, go back to the office, and bury myself in work until the mess with Chloe stopped stinging so much. Dr. Aris Thorne had been my physician for 6 years. He was the meticulous kind, old school, thorough, never satisfied with a surface-level answer. When I described the tremors, the dizzy spells, the fatigue that never seemed to lift no matter how much I slept, his face didn't have the reassuring look I was hoping for. Instead, it tightened with concern. "I want a full panel," he said, "and I want to run it expedited. Today." I sat in the waiting room afterward, my mind still replaying the image of Chloe's cold, disdainful expression from the night before. I almost didn't notice my phone buzzing in my pocket. It was Ross. "Sir," he said, and again that same careful tone from the 2 a.m. call. "We finished the sweep of the villa this morning, standard security protocol after the incident last night. We found something in Chloe's private vanity. I think you need to come see this in person, but I also think you need to know now before your appointment ends." "Just tell me," I said. "Vials, sir, small glass ones, unlabeled, hidden inside a false bottom in one of her cosmetic cases." I remember staring at the waiting room wall, at a generic painting of a lighthouse, and feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me. Vials. Hidden. Unlabeled. My mind tried to build an innocent explanation and failed every single time. 2 hours later, Dr. Thorne called me back into his office personally instead of sending a nurse, which told me everything before he even opened his mouth. "I'm going to be very direct with you," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Your blood work shows trace levels of a synthetic compound. It's not something the human body produces naturally, and it's not something that shows up on a standard panel, which is exactly why nobody caught it until now. It's slow-acting, calibrated, from what I can tell, to mimic the early stages of a degenerative neurological disorder. Tremors, dizziness, fatigue, cognitive fog eventually, if left unchecked. I sat there, gripping the arms of the chair, trying to process what he was telling me. Calibrated, I repeated. You mean someone designed this on purpose? I mean, this isn't an accident, and it isn't a random exposure, Dr. Thorne said carefully. Someone would have needed access to you consistently, your food, your drinks, something you ingest regularly, over a period of months in controlled doses. This wasn't a single incident. This was ongoing. I thought about every morning coffee Chloe had made for me with her own hands, insisting the housekeeper didn't do it right. Every evening tea she brought to my study while I worked late, telling me it would help me relax. Every single time she told me my symptoms were nothing, that I just needed rest, steering me away from doctors, away from tests, away from the truth. She wasn't just cheating on me with Marcus Sterling, she was finishing me. Slowly, patiently, precisely, the way you'd manage a long-term investment, letting it mature over time until the payout finally arrived. And the payout, I now understood with a sickening clarity, was my entire estate, my company, my fortune, everything I had built from nothing, waiting for her the moment my illness finally ran its course, and I either signed everything over to her in a moment of declining health or simply wasn't around to stop her from taking it. I sat in that office for a long time after Dr. Thorne finished explaining the treatment plan to flush the toxin from my system. He kept talking, dosage schedules, follow-up tests, monitoring, but I barely absorbed any of it. My mind was somewhere else entirely, turning over one devastating realization again and again. The affair had never been the real crime. It was just the visible symptom of something much darker running underneath. Chloe hadn't fallen out of love with me and found comfort in someone else's arms. She had planned this, methodically, coldly, over months, maybe longer, with a wealth manager who had unrestricted access to every account I owned. I walked out of that clinic a different man than the one who walked in. The anger from the night before, the humiliation of being called just a bank account, all of it curdled into something colder and far more dangerous. If Chloe wanted to play this as a calculated game, fine. I would show her exactly how calculated I could be. I walked into Apex Tech's headquarters the next morning, expecting sympathy. What I found instead was chaos. The elevator ride up to the executive floor felt longer than usual, my reflection in the mirrored doors looking hollowed out from 2 days without proper sleep. When the doors opened, I could already hear raised voices coming from the boardroom, and my assistant, Priya, met me halfway down the hall with a face pale enough to make my stomach drop before she said a single word. "You need to see this," she said, handing me her tablet. The headline hit me like a slap. "Billionaire tech mogul throws sick wife into storm," sources say. Below it, a blurry photo of Chloe from the night before, soaked and sobbing at our gate, mascara streaked down her face like something out of a tragic movie poster. The article painted a picture of a cold, controlling husband who had become paranoid and unstable, throwing his ailing wife out into a violent storm without warning, without mercy, without cause. I scrolled further. 3 more outlets had picked up nearly identical versions of the story within hours, all citing close sources and people familiar with the marriage. The narrative was clear, consistent, and clearly planted. Chloe hadn't just gone to the press. She had launched a coordinated media offensive, likely with help from a PR contact she'd cultivated during our marriage, someone I'd probably paid for at some point without even realizing it. By the time I reached the boardroom, 6 of my 9 directors were already seated, tension thick enough to choke on. Harold Weiss, our board chairman, didn't even wait for me to sit down. "Our stock dropped 11% in pre-market trading," he said flatly. 11% in 12 hours because of tabloid speculation about your marriage. The board is recommending you step back from day-to-day operations, effective immediately, until this settles." "Step back," I repeated. "You want me to step down because my wife is lying to reporters?" "We want you to protect this company," Harold said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Whatever the truth is, perception is moving faster than facts right now, and perception is what moves markets." I understood the logic, even as fury burned through my chest. I'd built Apex Tech from a garage prototype into a company employing 6,000 people. Watching it wobble because of a smear campaign engineered by the same woman who had been poisoning me for months felt like a special kind of cruelty. The kind that only someone who once loved you could design, because only they know exactly where it will hurt the most. I excused myself from the boardroom before I said something I couldn't take back, and I called the one person I trusted to think clearly when everyone else around me was panicking. Frank Ross had been my head of security for 4 years, but before that, he'd spent over a decade as a federal financial crimes investigator, chasing down exactly the kind of shell companies and offshore transfers that had been slowly draining my trust account. I'd hired him not just to guard my home, but because I'd always had a quiet instinct that someday I might need someone who understood both worlds, the boardroom and the back alley. We met privately that afternoon in a small conference room 3 floors below the executive suite, away from prying eyes and company gossip. "She's not just trying to save face," Ross said, sliding a printed timeline across the table. "Look at the pattern. The affair gets exposed. Within hours, she's leaking a sympathetic version of events to at least 3 outlets. That's not panic. That's strategy. Someone prepped this messaging in advance." "You think she planned for this?" I said. "Planned to get caught?" "I think she planned for the possibility," Ross said. "People running long financial plays like this always have a contingency for exposure. If the poisoning plan gets discovered too early, or the affair comes out before she's ready, she needs a fallback that still gets her a payout. A messy public divorce with her painted as the victim could still net her a massive settlement, especially if she frames you as unstable or abusive in the press first." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Chloe wasn't scrambling to protect her reputation out of wounded pride. She was executing Plan B. If she couldn't inherit everything through my slow, engineered decline, she'd extract a fortune through public sympathy and a scorched earth divorce instead. Either path led to the same destination for her, my money, one way or another. "I need proof," I said. "Real proof, not just tremors and vials, something a courtroom can't argue with." Ross tapped the folder again, this time flipping it open to a page I hadn't seen yet, a printout of financial transfer patterns he'd already started tracing before I even called him. "There's a name that keeps surfacing in these offshore transfers," he said. "Marcus Sterling's firm has handled every single one of them. If Chloe's playing chess with the media, Marcus is playing with your money. And men like that always leave a paper trail somewhere, because greed makes people sloppy." I looked at the timeline in front of me, the drop in our stock price still glowing on my phone screen, the tabloid headlines still fresh in my mind. The board wanted me to retreat. The public wanted a villain, and Chloe had made sure I was cast as one. But Ross was right about one thing. Chloe and Marcus were confident, careless, and drunk on the assumption that I'd never fight back with the same precision they'd used against me. That confidence was about to become their biggest mistake. We didn't wait for a convenient time. We didn't schedule anything through lawyers or send a polite letter requesting cooperation. Ross had spent the last decade of his career learning one simple truth about people who move dirty money. The moment you give them warning, the evidence disappears. So, at 9 in the morning, less than 18 hours after our meeting in the conference room, I walked into Sterling Financial Group's offices in the financial district, flanked by Frank Ross and a court-appointed forensic auditor named Elena Marsh, carrying a subpoena that had been rushed through a judge Ross had worked with for years. Marcus Sterling's office occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower he'd clearly built with money that wasn't entirely his own. When we walked in unannounced, his receptionist tried to stop us, stammering something about needing an appointment, but Ross simply held up the subpoena and kept walking. Marcus was at his desk when we entered, phone pressed to his ear, and I watched his expression shift the moment he saw us. He ended the call quickly, plastering on the same practiced, charming smile he'd used on me for nearly a decade. The smile that had made me trust him with my entire financial future straight out of business school. "This is unexpected," he said, standing, buttoning his jacket like the formality of the gesture might somehow steady the room. "I assume there's been some kind of misunderstanding, given everything that's happened with Chloe. I want you to know, none of that reflects on our professional relationship." "Sit down, Marcus," I said. It was the first time in 10 years I had ever interrupted him. Elena Marsh stepped forward and placed the subpoena on his desk, along with a formal request for full access to his firm's offshore transaction records spanning the last 2 years. Marcus's composure held for about 4 seconds after he read the first line. Then it cracked. You can't just walk in here and demand—" "The subpoena says otherwise," Ross said calmly. "You can cooperate now, on your own terms, or we can have federal auditors seize every server in this building by tomorrow morning. Your choice." Marcus looked at me, and for just a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but calculation. Like he was rapidly running numbers, trying to figure out how much I already knew and how much he could still spin. Whatever conclusion he reached, it wasn't good enough. He nodded slowly and gestured for his assistant to grant Elena access to the servers. It took less than 3 hours for Elena to find what she was looking for. She called us into a side conference room, her laptop open, 3 separate spreadsheets pulled up side by side, lines of transaction data highlighted in red. "There's a shell company," she said, turning the screen toward me. "Meridian Crest Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. It's been active for exactly 18 months. 18 months, I repeated, my stomach tightening. That matched almost exactly with the timeline of my declining health. "The company is registered under a single beneficial owner," Elena continued. "A woman named Valerie Ashford." The name didn't register at first. Then it hit me. Chloe's older sister. I'd met her maybe a handful of times over the years, mostly at holidays, always distant and vaguely resentful of the life Chloe had married into. I'd never once suspected she had any real involvement in our finances. "Over the past 18 months, Elena continued, pulling up another sheet, Meridian Crest received 41 separate transfers from accounts linked to your personal trust. Small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic compliance flags, but cumulatively, we're looking at just over $4.2 million. $4.2 million. Drained slowly, deliberately, structured specifically to stay under the radar of any standard audit. This wasn't a moment of financial temptation or a single reckless decision. This was a carefully engineered operation, built with the same patience and precision as the poison that had been working through my bloodstream for months. I looked at Marcus, who was sitting in the corner of the room now, his earlier charm completely gone, replaced by the pale, cornered look of a man watching his entire career collapse in real time. "You handled every single one of these transfers personally," I said. It wasn't a question. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently realizing there was no version of an explanation that made this look like anything other than exactly what it was. "This wasn't just an affair," Ross said quietly, almost to himself, staring at the spreadsheet. "This was never romantic at all. This was a business arrangement, dressed up as one." I felt something shift inside me as the full scope of the plan finally came into focus. Chloe hadn't fallen in love with Marcus and stumbled into greed as an afterthought. The affair had likely been the recruitment tool, a way to bring Marcus into a scheme that required someone with direct access to my accounts, someone willing to bend every fiduciary duty he'd sworn to uphold. Valerie had provided the clean legal structure to move the money without immediate suspicion, and the poison, patient and precise, had been the mechanism to eventually make all of it permanent, either through my slow decline or my death, whichever came first. It wasn't a love triangle gone wrong. It was a corporate heist, engineered by 3 people who had spent months studying my routines, my finances, and my blind trust, waiting patiently for the moment they could collect everything I'd built without me ever seeing it coming. I looked at Elena. "Where do we find Valerie Ashford right now?" She checked another document, then looked up at me. "According to the Shell company's registered contact address, she's currently docked at a marina about 40 minutes from here, a yacht registered under Meridian Crest Holdings." Ross was already reaching for his phone to arrange transportation. I felt the same cold, focused clarity I'd had 2 nights earlier, standing in my living room watching Chloe walk out into the storm. Only this time, I wasn't reacting. I was hunting. The marina smelled like salt and diesel, the kind of place where old money quietly parked new secrets. Ross drove us there himself, weaving through afternoon traffic with the focused calm of a man who had done this kind of thing 100 times before, back when he chased fraud cases for the federal government instead of running security details. "She'll deny everything at first," he told me as we walked down the long wooden dock, scanning the boat names painted along the hulls. "People like Valerie always do. She's not the mastermind here. She's the tool. And tools crack faster than the people who use them, especially when they realize they're expendable." We found the yacht near the end of the marina, a sleek 40-footer with the name Second Wind painted along its side, which felt almost like a cruel joke given what we now knew. 2 duffel bags sat open on the deck, half-packed with clothes, a passport visible on top of one of them. Valerie Ashford looked up from the deck the moment we approached, and I watched every trace of color drain from her face. She was younger than Chloe by 3 years, with the same sharp cheekbones, but none of Chloe's practiced composure. Whatever calm exterior Valerie normally wore had clearly abandoned her the second she saw 2 men walking toward her boat with the kind of expressions that meant business. "This is private property," she said, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. "Meridian Crest Holdings," Ross said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Registered under your name. 41 transfers totaling $4.2 million, moved out of accounts belonging to my client here over the last 18 months. Valerie's hand tightened on the duffel bag strap. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're packed for a flight," I said quietly, gesturing at the visible passport. "International, judging by the timing. Most people don't pack a go bag like that unless they already know something's coming apart." For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at the 2 of us, calculating, the same way Marcus had a few hours earlier. Then Ross played the card I hadn't expected him to have ready. "There's also the matter of attempted crime," he said flatly. Valerie's face went white. "What?" "Your brother-in-law has trace amounts of a synthetic toxin in his bloodstream," Ross continued, "calibrated to mimic a slow neurological decline. Someone with detailed knowledge of dosing schedules has been administering it to him for months. Given your involvement in the financial side of this operation, a prosecutor is going to have a very easy time arguing you knew exactly what the money was for." That was the moment Valerie's composure finally shattered completely. She sank down onto the bench along the deck railing, the duffel bag slipping from her hand, tears filling her eyes with a speed that told me this wasn't performance. This was genuine panic, the kind that comes when someone realizes the plan they signed onto has escalated somewhere far darker than they ever agreed to. "I didn't know about the poison," she said, her voice shaking. "I swear, I only knew about the money. Chloe told me it was just restructuring, protecting assets before a messy divorce. She said you were controlling, that you'd leave her with nothing if she asked for a split honestly. I set up the company because she asked me to, because she's my sister, and I believed her." "When did you find out it was more than that?" I asked. Valerie wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "About 2 months ago. She called me late one night, drunk, talking about how much longer it would take before your symptoms got bad enough that no one would question anything if something happened to you. I told her she was scaring me. She laughed it off, said I was overreacting, that everything was under control." "Under control," I repeated bitterly. "She said within the month," Valerie continued, the words tumbling out faster now, like a dam finally breaking after holding back too much pressure for too long. "That's what she told me 2 weeks ago, that Marcus was getting nervous. that they needed to finish it soon before you got suspicious, before your doctors caught something they shouldn't. My stomach turned cold. 2 weeks ago. If I hadn't come home early that night, if Ross hadn't flagged those transfers when he did, I might have had only a matter of weeks left before whatever finishing it meant became irreversible. "I have something," Valerie said suddenly, reaching into an inner pocket of the duffel bag with shaking hands. She pulled out a small digital recorder along with a phone. "Voice notes. Chloe sent them to me over the past few months, talking about the dosing schedule, timelines, what to do with the money once everything's settled. I kept them because, I don't know, some part of me knew I might need proof someday that I wasn't the one who planned any of this." Ross took the recorder carefully, treating it like the piece of evidence it now was. "If you hand this over and cooperate fully with federal investigators, testify to everything you just told us, there's a real chance you walk away from this with immunity instead of a conspiracy charge." Valerie nodded quickly, desperately, tears still streaming down her face. "Yes, whatever you need. I'll tell them everything. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to help my sister." I stood there on the deck of that yacht, staring at the recorder in Ross's hand, feeling the full weight of what we'd just uncovered settle over me. This wasn't a woman who fell out of love and made a series of increasingly desperate choices. This was a woman who had recruited her own sister into a financial conspiracy, seduced her financial advisor into becoming an accomplice, and methodically poisoned her husband, all while planning the exact month she intended to finish the job. "Within the month," I said quietly, mostly to myself. Ross looked at me, his expression grim. "Which means we don't have much time before they realize we're closing in. We need to move on the money before they can move it first." I looked out at the harbor, the sun beginning to dip low over the water, and felt that same cold clarity settle back into my chest. We had the proof now. It was time to close the trap completely. By the time we left the marina, the sun had dropped below the horizon, and Ross was already on the phone, coordinating with people whose names I recognized from federal financial crimes coverage over the years. I sat in the back of the car, replaying Valerie's voice in my head, "within the month," and feeling that cold clarity harden into something closer to resolve. We didn't sleep that night. My legal team, led by a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Diane Castellano, met us at a private conference room downtown at 10 p.m., and by midnight, we had assembled everything. Dr. Thorne's toxicology report, Elena's financial audit from Sterling's firm, Valerie's recorded confession, and the encrypted voice notes detailing dosing schedules that made my stomach turn every time I thought about listening to them again. "This is more than enough for an emergency asset freeze," Diane said, flipping through the printed documents at 4 in the morning, her coffee long gone cold beside her. "But we need to move fast. The moment federal authorities file for the freeze, there's a window, sometimes only a few hours, before word can leak and assets start disappearing into accounts we haven't traced yet." By 7 a.m., we were in a private conference room adjacent to a federal courtroom, working with 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Division that Ross had personal history with. Diane presented the evidence with the calm precision of someone who had done this 100 times, laying out the toxicology report beside the shell company transfers, cross-referencing every dollar amount with dates from Valerie's voice notes. The judge granted the emergency freeze by mid-morning. Every account tied to Marcus Sterling's firm, every account linked to Meridian Crest Holdings, every personal account belonging to Chloe that our forensic team had managed to trace. All of it locked down within the same hour, faster than either of them could have anticipated. I got the confirmation call from Diane just after 11 a.m., standing in my kitchen, staring out at the ocean through the same window where I used to watch Chloe make my morning coffee. "It's done," Diane said. "Every account is frozen. They can't move a single dollar without triggering a compliance flag that goes straight to federal investigators." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt hollow, thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything, my company, my fortune, possibly my life, to 2 people who had spent 18 months treating me like a slow-motion transaction. Ross had a contact monitoring communications tied to Marcus's known devices, part of the broader investigation now that federal authorities were officially involved. Around 2 in the afternoon, he called me with an update that made everything click into place. "Marcus is panicking," Ross said. "He just found out his accounts are frozen, and from what we're seeing, he can't access a cent. Not for lawyers, not for a flight, nothing. He's messaging Chloe directly, no longer trying to hide the communication trail because he doesn't have the luxury of being careful anymore." "What's he saying?" "He wants her to go back to the villa," Ross said. "There's apparently a master bottle of the toxin still hidden somewhere on the property, the original source material, not just trace residue. He's telling her they need to retrieve it and destroy it before forensics gets a warrant to search the estate." I felt my jaw tighten. "So there's still physical evidence at my own house?" "Looks that way," Ross said. "And now that they're cut off financially, cornered with nothing to lose, they're desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. This is actually the best possible outcome for us. It means Chloe has to come back to the one place we have complete control over." I sat with that for a moment, staring out at the same storm-battered coastline where I'd watched her walk into the rain 3 nights earlier. There was something almost poetic about it, in a dark, bitter way. She had used my own home as a place to slowly poison me for months. Now that same house was about to become the place where everything finally came apart for her. "When do you think she'll come?" I asked. "Soon," Ross said. "Marcus is pushing hard, and from the tone of the messages, he's not being subtle about the urgency. If I had to guess, tonight. Under cover of the storm system that's supposed to roll back through the coast this evening. It's the kind of weather that makes security systems easier to slip past, or at least that's what they'll be counting on." I thought about the back gate security protocol Ross and I had discussed earlier that week, a secondary access point rarely used, mostly there as an emergency exit route in case of fire or medical crisis. It occurred to me then, with a kind of dark clarity, exactly how we could use their desperation against them. "Leave it open," I said. Ross paused. "The back gate?" "Disable the alarm on it specifically," I said. "Nothing else. Let her think she found a genuine gap in security. Let her believe she's slipping past me undetected." Ross was quiet for a moment, and I could tell he was turning the idea over, weighing the risk against the opportunity. "If she comes in through there, we'll have eyes on her from the moment she steps onto the property. We can document everything, the retrieval, the intent, all of it, in real time. It would be airtight." "Then that's what we do," I said. I stood by the window for a long time after we hung up, watching storm clouds begin to gather again over the water, dark and heavy, rolling in exactly the way they had the night I'd thrown her out into the rain. There was a strange symmetry to it, like the universe itself was setting the stage for how this story needed to end. Chloe and Marcus had spent 18 months building an elaborate scheme designed to make my downfall look like nothing more than tragic natural misfortune. Now, cut off from every dollar they'd stolen and cornered by their own greed, they were about to walk directly into the one trap they never saw coming, because it was hiding in plain sight, inside the very home they thought they already controlled. I checked my watch. Somewhere out there, Chloe was probably already making plans to come back tonight. This time, I would be the one waiting in the dark. The storm rolled in exactly as Ross predicted, arriving just after 9 that night with the same violent energy as the one that had soaked Chloe 3 nights earlier. I sat in the villa's monitoring room, a small space off the main hallway that housed the security feeds, my eyes fixed on the bank of screens showing every angle of the property. The front gate, the courtyard, the cliffside path, and the back gate, the one deliberately left with its alarm disabled. Ross sat beside me, 2 federal agents positioned discreetly outside near the tree line, far enough to stay hidden, but close enough to move the moment we needed them. Diane had insisted on documenting every second of whatever happened tonight, which was why a 3rd screen in front of us was recording directly from the monitoring system, time-stamped and ready to be handed over as evidence the instant this was over. "You don't have to be the one sitting here," Ross said quietly, glancing at me. "I can watch this from the security office. You could wait upstairs." "No," I said. "I need to see this myself." He didn't argue further. I think some part of him understood that after everything, the affair, the poison, the smear campaign, the financial heist, I needed to witness the ending with my own eyes, not hear about it secondhand from a report. Just past 11, the back gate camera flickered with movement. I leaned forward instinctively, watching as a hooded figure moved carefully along the tree line, using an old physical key to override the gate's manual lock instead of the biometric system I'd already cut her off from. Even through the grainy night vision feed, I recognized the way she moved. Quick, deliberate steps, always glancing over her shoulder, a habit I remembered from years of watching her sneak in late after girls' nights that I now understood was something else entirely. Chloe. She slipped through the gate and made her way across the dark grounds toward the side entrance nearest the wine cellar, exactly the path Ross had predicted she'd take. My chest tightened watching her move through my property like a stranger, like an intruder, when 3 days ago she had been walking these same paths as my wife. "She's heading for the cellar access," Ross murmured, watching the second screen as she disappeared from the courtyard camera and reappeared moments later on the interior feed near the sub-level door, just like Marcus's messages indicated. I felt my pulse quicken as the camera inside the wine cellar picked her up. She moved with the same practiced familiarity she'd always had in that space. She'd chosen the wine cellar years ago as her personal project, curating bottles from vineyards we'd visited together on trips that now felt like they belonged to someone else's marriage entirely. She knew every shelf, every hidden compartment, every loose stone in that room better than I did. She crouched near the far wall, running her fingers along the mortar between the bricks until she found what she was looking for. A section came loose in her hands, and she reached into the gap behind it, pulling out a small, unassuming wooden box. My jaw tightened as I watched her open it on the screen. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, sat a single glass bottle, larger than the vials Ross's team had found in her vanity, clearly the original source material Marcus had referenced in his panicked messages. The master bottle. The thing that had been sitting in my own wine cellar for who knows how long, a few careless bricks away from where I'd stored bottles for anniversaries and celebrations that now felt like elaborate performances. She slipped the bottle carefully into an inner pocket of her coat, and I watched her exhale. A long, visible breath of relief on the grainy camera feed, like a woman who believed she had just successfully erased the last piece of evidence connecting her to everything she'd done. "Now," I said quietly to Ross. He nodded and gave the signal through his earpiece to the 2 agents stationed outside, then reached over and flipped the switch that controlled the cellar's overhead lighting. I watched on the screen as the room flooded with bright light, and Chloe froze completely, her hand still resting on the loose brick, her body rigid with shock. On the monitor, I could see her head snap up toward the stairwell, toward the sound of footsteps I knew were coming, because I'd asked Ross to let me be the one who walked down first. I left the monitoring room and made my way down the hallway toward the cellar stairs myself, my heart pounding harder than it had in the boardroom, harder than it had at Sterling's office, harder even than the moment 3 nights earlier when I'd first seen those photographs on the coffee table. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Chloe was standing exactly where the camera had shown her, frozen against the stone wall, the wooden box still open at her feet, the bottle clutched in her coat pocket. Her hood had fallen back, rain-damp hair sticking to her face, and for the first time since I'd found those photographs, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like fear. "You," she whispered. "Me," I said, stepping fully into the light. "In my own house, waiting for you to finish the job." Her eyes darted toward the stairwell behind me, calculating an exit that didn't exist anymore. Ross appeared at the top of the stairs, blocking the only way out, his expression unreadable, professional, exactly the calm I needed in that moment because my own composure was hanging on by threads. "It's over, Chloe," I said. "All of it. The affair, the money, the poison. We know everything." She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, soaked and trembling, staring at me across the same cellar where she'd spent years pretending to build something with me, while quietly plotting to take it all away. For a long moment, no one moved. The rain hammered against the small ground-level windows of the cellar, and the only sound besides the storm was Chloe's breathing, fast and uneven, the sound of someone realizing there was no version of this night that ended in her favor. "Say something," I said. "You always have something to say." Her jaw tightened, and I watched her try to rebuild the same cold composure she'd shown me 3 nights earlier in the living room. It didn't quite hold this time. Her hands were shaking as she straightened up, the wooden box still open at her feet, the bottle still clutched inside her coat. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice catching. "Marcus pushed for all of it. The company, the transfers, that was his plan from the start. I never wanted—" "Stop," I said, and something in my voice made her actually stop. "I heard your sister's confession. I have the recordings, Chloe. Your voice, talking about dosing schedules, talking about timelines, talking about how much longer it would take before no one questioned anything if something happened to me." Her face went pale in the harsh cellar light. I nodded to Ross, who had already set up a small speaker connected to his phone, exactly as we'd planned on the drive back from the marina. He pressed play, and Chloe's own voice filled the stone room. Tinny, but unmistakable, pulled from one of the encrypted notes Valerie had handed over on the yacht. "Just needs another few weeks. The dosage is working exactly like Marcus said it would. Nobody's going to question a health decline that slow. By the time anyone even thinks to test for something like this, it'll already be out of his system." The recording clicked off. Chloe's eyes had filled with tears, but I felt nothing soften in my chest this time. I'd spent 3 days learning exactly how manufactured her tears could be. "You were poisoning me for money," I said quietly. "Not because you fell out of love, not because I worked too much or wasn't there enough. You wanted my death to look natural so you could inherit everything without ever having to fight for a divorce settlement. And when that started moving too slowly for you, you built a backup plan through Marcus and Valerie to bleed the accounts dry anyway." "It wasn't supposed to go that far," she said, her voice cracking. "Marcus said it would just be enough to disorient you, enough to make you dependent on us for decisions. I didn't know he'd escalate the dosage the way he did." "Don't," I said. "Don't put this all on him. You made the coffee, Chloe. You made the tea. You told me every single time that I was just tired, that I didn't need a doctor. That wasn't Marcus standing beside me every morning telling me to trust you instead of getting help." She had no answer for that. Her mouth opened, then closed again, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely, completely out of options. That's when the door at the top of the stairs opened again, and 2 federal agents stepped down into the cellar behind Ross, their presence filling the small stone room with a finality that made Chloe's shoulders finally drop. "Chloe Ashford," one of the agents said, stepping forward with practiced calm. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted crime, and several related federal charges. You have the right to remain silent." I watched them read her the rest of her rights, watched the cuffs click around her wrists, watched the last traces of the woman I'd married dissolve into someone I genuinely didn't recognize anymore. Someone who had spent 18 months treating my life as a long-term investment strategy. She looked at me one last time as they led her toward the stairs, her expression somewhere between desperation and disbelief. "I loved you once," she said. "In the beginning. That part was real." "Maybe," I said. "But it stopped being real a long time before I ever found those photographs. You just made sure I didn't find out until it was almost too late." They walked her up the stairs and out through the courtyard, where the storm had begun to ease into a steady drizzle. I followed a few steps behind, standing in the same doorway where I'd watched her get thrown out into the rain 3 nights earlier, except this time it was federal agents leading her away instead of my own security team. As they guided her into a waiting vehicle, Headlights swept across the driveway from a second car pulling in through the front gate. I recognized Marcus Sterling's silhouette in the back seat even before the agents opened the door. Pale, disheveled, stripped of every ounce of the polished confidence he'd worn for a decade as my trusted advisor. Ross told me later that federal agents had picked him up at the local airfield just minutes before he could board a private charter flight arranged under a name that clearly wasn't his own. I stood in the driveway long after both vehicles pulled away, rain misting softly around me, the cliffside villa behind me finally quiet for the first time in days. Ross came to stand beside me, his hands in his pockets, watching the tail lights disappear down the winding coastal road. "It's done," he said. "Both of them, in custody. The evidence is airtight. This isn't going away for either of them." I nodded, but I didn't feel the triumph I expected, just exhaustion, and beneath it, something quieter. Relief, maybe, or the beginning of it. The poison was still working its way out of my system. The betrayal was still raw. But for the first time since that 2 a.m. phone call from Ross in Singapore, I finally felt like I was standing on solid ground again. "Go home and sleep," Ross said. "You've earned it." I looked back at the villa, lights glowing steady against the dark, storm clouds finally beginning to break apart overhead. For the first time in months, I believed I actually could. 10 days can feel like a lifetime when you spend them waiting for the truth to catch up with the lies. By the time I stood on my terrace that morning, watching the sun rise fully over the ocean for the first time without a headache pressing behind my eyes, most of the chaos had finally settled. The stock market, it turned out, forgives quickly once the real story comes out. The moment federal charges against Chloe and Marcus became public, conspiracy, fraud, attempted crime, the tabloid narrative that had painted me as a cruel, paranoid husband collapsed overnight. Reporters who had eagerly run Chloe's version of events a week earlier scrambled just as quickly to run corrections, though none of them ever quite matched the size or urgency of the original headlines. Harold Weiss called me personally 3 days after the arrests, his voice completely different from the tense, cornered tone he'd used in that boardroom. "Apex Tech closed today at an all-time high," he said. "The board wants to formally apologize for how quickly we moved to sideline you. We should have trusted you from the start." I accepted the apology, though some part of me understood it wasn't really about trust. It was about how fast perception moves compared to truth, and how much damage can be done in the gap between them. I didn't hold it against Harold or the board. I'd learned in the span of about a week that even the people closest to you can be maneuvered by a well-constructed lie if it's told with enough confidence. Dr. Thorne's final call came on the 9th day, and I remember exactly where I was standing when my phone rang. In the kitchen, staring out at the same window where Chloe used to make my morning coffee, now finally repainted with a different memory attached to it. "Your latest panel came back completely clean," he said. "The toxin is fully out of your system. No lingering neurological markers, no signs of long-term damage. You got lucky. If this had gone even a few more weeks without intervention, we might be having a very different conversation." A few more weeks. Exactly the timeline Valerie had overheard Chloe mention in that drunken late-night phone call. I thanked Dr. Thorne, hung up, and stood there for a long moment, just breathing, feeling something in my chest finally unclench after days of quiet, low-grade dread that I hadn't fully admitted to myself I was still carrying. Diane called later that same afternoon with an update on the legal proceedings. Marcus Sterling, faced with overwhelming financial evidence and the toxicology report tying the poisoning scheme directly back to substances traceable through his private lab contacts, had already begun negotiating a plea deal, apparently hoping to reduce his sentence by cooperating fully against Chloe. Valerie's immunity agreement had been finalized, her testimony locked in as one of the strongest pieces of evidence the prosecution had. Chloe herself remained defiant during her arraignment, according to Diane, denying any direct role in the poisoning despite the recordings, despite the financial trail, despite everything. The judge denied bail for both her and Marcus, citing flight risk given the offshore accounts and the private jet booked under a false name. "It's going to be a long trial," Diane told me. "But with what we have, I don't see a realistic path where either of them walks away from this without serious prison time." I asked her, almost as an afterthought, what would happen to Valerie now that her immunity deal was finalized. "She'll walk away without charges," Diane said. "But I doubt her life looks anything like it did before this. She lost her sister in every way that matters, and she'll carry the weight of what she almost helped happen to you for a long time, immunity or not." I thought about that for a while after we hung up. How even the people who escape legal consequences don't always escape the damage entirely. Valerie would live the rest of her life knowing exactly how close she came to being an accessory to something irreversible. That was its own kind of sentence. Now, standing on my terrace on the 10th day, coffee in hand, made by my own hands, the way I'd started making it every morning since that first night, I let myself simply look at the ocean for a while, without thinking about spreadsheets, subpoenas, or toxicology reports. The betrayal still stung when I let myself sit with it too long. 7 years of marriage, reduced in her mind to nothing more than a slow, patient transaction. I doubted that particular wound would fully heal for a long time, if ever completely. But sitting with the pain honestly felt different than the version of it I'd been carrying for months without realizing it. The quiet, creeping physical decline that had made me feel like I was losing my mind, my health, and my grip on reality all at once. Engineered carefully by someone I trusted completely. I thought about Ross's words from that night in the driveway. "Go home and sleep. You've earned it." I hadn't fully believed him then, still running on adrenaline and disbelief. Standing here now, 10 days later, with clean blood work, a stabilized company, and the truth finally public, I believed it. Cutting Chloe out of my life hadn't just saved my fortune, it had saved my life, quite literally, in ways I was still fully processing. The storm that had raged the night I threw her out into the rain felt like a lifetime ago now, replaced by calm mornings, and mornings where I could trust the coffee in my own hands. I took a deep breath of salt air, watching the waves roll steadily against the cliffs below, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something close to peace. Whatever came next, rebuilding trust, rebuilding routines, learning how to simply exist without constantly checking for hidden threats in my own home, I would face it on my own terms, in my own home, finally free of the slow poison that had nearly cost me everything. The next chapter was mine again, and this time, no one else was writing it for me.